Hello and welcome back to the Arturia Synthi tutorial series. Another preset deep dive for you today, dealing with this A-Door tracers. Let's hear it. I'm having to hold the key down on the keyboard this time. It's not a keyboard sequencer based sequence, it's coming from the modulations page. So let's figure out what's going on with this one. Now, the first thing that's really weird is that when you go to the functions page, everything's populated, but everything's at 0%. So I could very easily just jump over this page and not really talk about it at all. And for the first three parameters, I am actually going to ignore them because I basically just had a play with these. If you get something that's actually not fundamental part of the sound, have a dive in, see if it's interesting to you. It actually isn't. There wasn't very much kind of good stuff coming out of those, so I'm just going to skip over them. But these two at the bottom, I do want to have a quick word about because they sound really great when you bring them in. So we've got channel 1 pan, which at about 20%, sounding pretty good. And then when you combine that with this FX value, you get a really kind of syncopated, I really like that kind of pulsing thing that's going on between those two values. FX1 dry wet, FX1 is a delay. So we're bringing in that delay over this triangular modulation kind of pattern. And it's just, I'm only covering this very, very briefly because by default they're at 0%. But I thought it was interesting to, if you come across stuff that's plugged in but at 0%, see what they do. You know, are they contributing to the sound if you do something really very minimal to them? And in fact, that story continues because we've got the same kind of thing on the joystick. They're all set to 0 as well. Now, in order for us to have a bit of a play with these, I'm actually temporarily going to disable the pin matrix's joystick because obviously that would get in the way. And then just bring all of these values up to about halfway. We haven't got into the substantive part of the sound yet, we're just kind of nerdling around, having a bit of a play. But I'm kind of curious to see what this does, and it turns out it's pretty great. Nothing wrong with that. So let's have a very quick look at these before we actually get on to deal with the real sound. Filter frequency, don't need to really talk about that. Oscillator 1 saw level, so oscillator 1 is one of the primary sound sources and the saw level is set to maximum. So on the X mod, when we go all the way X, and on the Y we've got FX2 and FX3 dry wet. We've got a chorus and a flanger. We're going to deal with all of these in more detail shortly, but it's those two effects coming in and out. Always worth having a look at stuff that's at 0 and asking yourself, why is that at 0? It doesn't make any sense. Now normally with these deconstructs I start with the pin matrix first, but on this particular sound the sequence coming out of the modulations page is so dominant that we have to pay attention to it immediately. There are other pins tying into the filter frequency, but they're all completely dwarfed by this. And it's a little bit difficult to just take it away. Remember when we dealt with the modulations page and I said don't think you can just turn this thing off and then it's having no effect. It is, that value is still live. And you see where the step sequence has stopped, it stopped on a negative bar. I'm going to press a note on the keyboard. You hear basically nothing. Because the filter oscillator's frequency is set very low. This is taking it down to basically 0. And so all of the high frequencies are being attenuated. If I let this step on and pause it on a positive bar, now we get sound. So always remember that this modulations page is live all the time. Now, we are going to come back to it later, but just for now, I'm going to turn it off, really off. I've actually just completely taken this sequencer out of the game. And so now we're going to hear the original Synthi's native tone without being affected by the advanced page, and it sounds like it's not very interesting, is it? Because the frequencies controls turned all the way down. So to compensate for the fact that I've just taken this sequencer out of the loop, I'm just going to bring the frequency knob up a little bit. So what have we done there? Well, that modulation effect in the modulation page, the sequencer being set to almost maximum, means when you're on a high bar, that's basically everything, you know, that's just completely dominating the sound. But when you're on a low bar, you're taking stuff away, and then you're relying on other modulation sources to bring the filter frequency back up to audible levels. And as you can see, we've got this joystick in here as well, which I took away earlier. We've got multiple modulation sources feeding into the filter oscillator, giving the frequency every single one of those extra little bits of control voltage. They're all accumulating together to give it some chance of being heard. So without the sequencer, I have to manually increase the frequency knob to give us any chance of hearing anything at all. And now that we've got that level of stability, we can start. We've given ourselves some headroom. You know, we've still got modulation capacity to go, so we can still hear these effects taking hold, but now we can focus in on each of them and find out what's that doing. And the first one I'm going to deal with is oscillator 3, because it's operating, it says A#4. I prefer, if an oscillator is not being used as a sound source, I would rather it be set to unquantized, but I'm going to take it, you know, that's what they've given us, so we'll play with it. So A#4 is fast. It's, I don't know, however many hundreds of hertz. So the effect that you're having on the filter frequency isn't directly audible, it's a frequency modulation effect. So what I'm going to do is get a constant note up and then pull the oscillator's frequency down so that we can hear it. But just bear in mind that this is an extremely small modulation effect on the entire sound source. It's really, really subtle, but I want to crank it up to hear what it can do. So I'm going to give it some beans, then start bringing this thing down. And we're still way out of identifiable range. There we go. It's like magic. So now we're hearing individual oscillations. Finally, we can really listen to that oscillator having an effect on the sound. So this is this one here. Change the shape. Double click to set it back to 0. And then send it all the way back up to A#4. So that's what it's doing. Now that was a very subtle effect, really, really small modulation amount, but that doesn't mean we just ignore it. You know, dive in there, find out what it does. If it's doing something that you really like the sound of, when it was coming down into identifiable range, that's just gorgeous. That's the stuff I want to be able to find. And then we throw it away mercilessly. Let's have a look at the trapezoid. So this is the envelope shape, and while I've got a key held down, the envelope gate is fully open, which means that we expect this to be having a positive modulation on the filter. Take it away, it's going to get duller. There we go. But I found it interesting when I was having a look at this sound earlier to think, well, that's all very well and good, but if I've got the trapezoid pin in there, I really want to make it work for its dinner. And it's not really a very interesting envelope shape. If I crank this decay up a little bit, now when I let go of the key, I've got a new cool thing. That's the the trapezoid decay just tailing away. Again, not what we've been given out of the box, but you know, this is our tool, we can do what we want with it. Now we've got sample and hold, and this is coming from the noise generator. So noise generator into sample and hold, out into filter frequency. A really common pairing. You see these two modules being used an awful lot. So the sample and hold is basically just taking a random snapshot, whatever frequency happens to be coming out of the noise generator at that moment in time, and then it holds it for half a bar. Again, pretty subtle level. These are all like minimal impacts that are all accumulating together to have a bigger effect. But sod that, let's crank it up and hear what it's really doing. Excellent, that's what that's doing. Obviously you could speed it up if you wanted. Little bit of slew just to take the hard edges off the changes. And then finally, right down at the bottom, we've already seen the joystick. So this is the original, this is the OG Synthi stretching its legs now. None of this modulation page nonsense. That was really awesome stuff. Now let's bring all of that back in and then consider all of that in the context of the modulation page and what it's doing. So we've got these big bars up and down, these big control voltages, and in these negative ranges, almost all of the frequency was starting at almost zero. So when we pull that far down, the rest of the modulation control voltages have to work really hard to get us back to anything approaching audible. And in fact, that's often the case in this sound. You get periods of brief silence, and that's what gives us the contrast. If I bring this ratio down and need to bring the frequency knob up to compensate for the fact that I've thrown so much stuff away. Now we're getting notes on every one of those bars rather than just a couple of them. Got a modulation wheel attached to FX3. Let's have a look at the effects. So this is the flanger. We saw this in use when we looked at the joystick earlier, but let's get the mod wheel in on the action. So that's mod wheel all the way down, all the way up. Just throw the sound away and get back to the bass sound again so that we can have a look at the oscillators. Let's do oscillator 1 first on its own with an asterisk. Come back here in a moment. So that's the basic sound. Standard sawtooth, maximum level, 262 Hz, nice and simple, playing a C. The situation gets a little bit muddier when we look at oscillator 2 because those were the pin configurations. So on its own, oscillator 2, we've got the square wave output, an octave lower, 131 Hz. But we've got oscillator 2's triangle wave applying frequency modulation to oscillator 1. So on its own, oscillator 1 on its own, with FM. Let's bring that FM effect in, make it more dramatic. That's the triangle wave, cycling 131 times a second, absolutely ruining oscillator 1's day. Let's bring the frequency down and then we'll be able to hear those individual modulations. Go through that raspy nastiness around 50 Hz. Up and down, up and down. And And finally, right at the end of the day, we've got the reverb unit in the chain. So we've got this. That's a full wet. Quite a subtle effect, just adding a little bit of reverb to the whole sound. Glorious sound design, absolutely fantastic sound. And that's the end of this video series. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it useful. If you did, please consider subscribing, hit notifications. You'll be sure not to miss my other content. Hope to see you there. Thanks a lot.